A door locked from the outside. But who held the key? Welcome to Phantom Mystery. I am Edmund Cross. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Your messages make every story feel closer. It was a fine June afternoon in the village of St. Aldwyn, the sort of day that seemed almost too perfect to be true. The lawns of the vicarage had been laid out with trestle tables, delicate porcelain teacups, and great bowls of strawberries, their red gleam softened beneath thick drifts of cream. Children ran laughing among the rose bushes, while the ladies of the Women's Institute busied themselves with cake-cutting and jam competitions. Miss Jane Marple, quietly seated beneath the shade of a horse-chestnut tree, sipped her tea without fuss. She was not a woman given to intrusion, but her sharp blue eyes missed very little. The way Mrs. Pembroke eyed her rival's sponge cake with faint malice, or the surreptitious whisper exchanged between the innkeeper's wife and a stranger who clearly did not belong to the village. At the heart of the afternoon's merriment stood Mrs. Agnes Rowley, the cheerful proprietress of the King's Arms, the only inn for 10 miles and a place of local pride. Agnes was a bustling woman, red-cheeked and stout, with a laugh that carried across the lawn. Yet there was something oddly restless in her manner that day. She excused herself more than once, fumbling with the heavy set of keys she always carried at her waist. "Always in a hurry, that one," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley to her neighbour, her tone disapproving. But then innkeeping is a restless trade. Too many travellers passing through, and not all respectable. Miss Marple allowed the words to drift over her. Gossip, yes, but gossip was a mirror in which truth sometimes flashed unexpectedly. The festivity reached its height when the vicar rose to thank the guests. Glasses clinked, laughter rose, and then, quite suddenly, a shriek cut through the air. All eyes turned. It was Agnes Rowley, standing at the edge of the lawn, her face drained of colour. In her hand she clutched her key-ring, but it was empty, the keys gone. "The inn," she gasped, her voice breaking. I can't get in. My doors are locked from the inside." A ripple of confusion spread. What did it matter if the innkeeper had misplaced her keys? But before anyone could dismiss the incident, young Tommy Briggs, who had raced ahead to see, came tearing back, his face white with terror. "There's someone inside," he shouted. "Someone? On the floor!" The laughter and chatter died as quickly as a candle snuffed. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her fingers steady, though her heart gave the smallest of tremors. It was no longer an ordinary summer afternoon. It was the beginning of a murder. Villagers left the vicarage lawn in a flurry of certainty that had no facts to sustain it. Miss Marple, small and composed, went with them at an unhurried pace, listening to how fear ripens into narrative. Mrs. Price Ridley named gypsies, Colonel Brabazon favoured poachers, Mr. Petherick proposed a motorist with the morals of a weasel. The King's Arms stood tidy and square at the corner of the High Street, its mullioned eyes blind behind drawn curtains. Tommy Briggs hovered on the step, anxious to be believed. I saw him through the pantry window, he told Sergeant Hawkes when the sergeant arrived. Her man on the floor by the hearth. Hawkes tried the front and back doors, then the scullery. Each held firm. A constable rattled the upstairs sashes from outside and reported them latched within. "There's the cellar," Agnes said. "The hatch in the yard, if the staple can be forced." Mr. Weems the blacksmith came with his bar, his gentleness surprising in a man whose hands were an advertisement for iron. The staple yielded. Cool cask-scented air rose from below. Hawkes went first with a lantern. Miss Marple followed as far as the stairs' foot, where one can see without seeming to. The tap-room held the shocked hush of a church just after a hymn. A man lay on his side near the hearth, one arm outstretched as though he had reached for explanation and found none. Hawkes knelt, because that is what one does, and said in a low official voice, "Neck broken. An hour or two likely. Doctor will confirm." The face was narrow, mid-40s, courteous in death as in life. "Leonard Pike," said Mr. Finch, the postmaster, who considered knowledge a civic duty. "Took room 2 at noon yesterday. From Bristol," he said. "Paid a night in advance. No luggage beyond a valise, quiet, tipped in pennies and silence. Agnes flinched and steadied herself against the bar. He was polite, she said. Boiled mutton for luncheon. He asked for it. He went out early and came back by 1:30. Nothing remarkable. Her fingers kept finding the empty chain at her waist, as if absence could be plucked back into being. Hawkes fetched the register. The name, Leonard Pike, sat in small upright letters. Beneath it, a round dot of ink had settled like a thought that hesitated. The blotter that usually lived beside the book was missing. Miss Marple, drifting near under cover of setting down her shawl, noticed a faint dusting of eraser crumbs along the edge of the page. Locked room, Hawkes said. Doors fast, windows latched. He might have tripped and struck his head there. He touched the iron of the grate and came away with soot. Fools love stairs, Miss Marple murmured. A hearth is a decision. No one objected. They rarely do to old ladies. The doctor came thin and exact. Neck broken, he agreed. Bruise at the temple, either before the fall or in it. Time between 1 and 3. The body was covered and borne out. The tap room looked more empty than empty rooms usually do, as if absence had weight. Gossip crept in to warm the place. Agnes had dismissed a chambermaid last month. The brewery bill had been late. These facts, or rehearsals for facts, twined around the thing no one could explain, the keys. Agnes spoke steadily of hours and errands and the latch, but her voice carried the carefulness of someone stepping on ice. Hannah, the maid, arrived with a brightness that did not reach her eyes. "A boy fetched me," she said. "Mother wanted tea at 1. I left, put the latch to and went." She showed her single pantry key. Miss Marple said mildly, "Your mother prefers 4:30, dear, for her digestion." Hannah smiled too quickly. She felt peckish, she said. By evening the inn was shut and yet full, for a house is never more crowded than when it holds a story. Miss Marple walked home through lanes that folded in on themselves like tidy napkins. She thought about the register blot. People blot when they pause, and the eraser crumbs people erase when they regret. She thought about boiled mutton, and about a curl of blue paper glimpsed beneath a settle. At home she made tea and wrote 3 lines in a small notebook. Pike, small hand, cautious writer, chooses hearth. Agnes, competent, key ring empty, answers measured. Hannah, summons unlikely, smile too quick. She added, blue ticket curl. Soft things hide edges. Then she slept, the sleep of those who have not solved a problem but have learned its manners. Morning brought a brisk honesty. Miss Marple cut a small posy of sweet peas and mint and went to the King's Arms. Agnes, pale but tidy, sat behind the bar. Miss Marple set down the flowers and spoke of garden matters. Agnes's mouth softened. "I didn't kill him," she said suddenly, as if the words had been pressing against her teeth. "I have kept an inn 20 years and never killed anyone. He was ordinary. Ordinary as a costume," Miss Marple said. "People wear it to pass unremarked. Did Mr. Pike admire anything?" "The clock," Agnes said. He watched it too long. He tried 3 chairs and chose by the hearth. He asked when the bell rings. "At 1 and at 3, said Miss Marple. "Bells give people permission to act." She looked at Agnes's hands. "The keys?" Agnes's fingers trembled. "I found them last night, in the sugar bin. I cleaned them and put them back on the chain this morning. I didn't tell Sergeant Hawkes. I didn't know what to say." She looked torn. "Sugar preserves and conceals," Miss Marple observed. "Thank you for telling me." She did not press the matter. Confidences are birds. One keeps still if one wants them to stay. Hawkes came in, bustling with purpose. He nodded to Miss Marple and faced Agnes. "We'll take your statement again, ma'am, and include everything. Found keys don't improve by being shy." Agnes looked stricken. Miss Marple stepped into the line of force without appearing to. "Sergeant," she said, "allow me a small suggestion. Villagers seldom look up. A person might exit by the scullery roof, and in by the landing window if he had a loop of string to lower the sash. Mr. Sims courted Mrs. Larch that way when her brother objected." "Hawkes." grateful for something to do, went to inspect the window that stuck halfway and might be coaxed down without hands upon it. Alone again with Agnes, Miss Marple said, "Yesterday someone borrowed the raffle book from your counter." Agnes blinked. Mrs. Price Ridley took it to show the prizes. "I didn't mind." Miss Marple thought of the blue curl and of eraser crumbs. People practice on what won't matter before they alter what does. She rose to go. At the door she noticed a thin sugar dusting on the floorboards, an untidiness Agnes would never allow on an ordinary day. Outside, the signboard creaked once and was still. The village had the breath-held look of a place that expects to be surprised and disapproves. Miss Marple turned toward the high street, thinking of bells and string and chairs by hearths, and of a small, deliberate blot that signalled a mind pausing before it decided which story it meant to tell. The day after Miss Marple's quiet visit to the inn was one of unease for the whole of St. Aldwyn. Windows opened earlier than usual, curtains twitched more frequently, and the clatter of gossip carried over hedges and garden walls as easily as the call of blackbirds. The King's Arms, normally a hive of respectable industry, stood shuttered and silent, which gave it an air of guilt far greater than any testimony Sergeant Hawkes might record. Agnes Rowley, seen only in fleeting glances at the door or through an upstairs window, had become the unwilling centerpiece of speculation. Some said she had quarrelled with the dead man. Others suggested she had hidden him under false pretenses. Still others, indulging the natural love of melodrama that even the most pious villagers possess, hinted that she had a double life and that the murder was the result of it. Miss Marple, seated by her parlour window with her knitting in her lap, allowed herself the luxury of listening to the hum of speculation with an almost clinical detachment, for she knew gossip, when allowed to ferment, often revealed more truth than deliberate inquiry. Mrs. Price Ridley had been particularly industrious, paying calls to half the households on the high street before luncheon. She brought with her theories more elaborate than the sponge cakes she habitually entered into the Women's Institute competitions. One of these was that Mr. Pike, the dead lodger, had been a blackmailer, come to torment poor Agnes for something in her past. Another was that he was an escaped convict, living under an assumed name. Each theory was delivered with such relish that it became less important whether it was true, and more important that the teller be thought clever for conceiving it. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hawkes went about his business in the solid, unimaginative manner of a man trained to look for footprints and fingerprints, though neither were likely to avail him much in the village. He had spent the morning questioning Hannah, the maid, who had grown more nervous under his inquiries. Her story of her mother's sudden need for tea had not improved in the retelling. Hawkes noted that inconsistency, though he seemed to lean toward the possibility that Hannah had been tricked or misled, rather than that she herself was guilty of any violent act. Miss Marple did not share the sergeant's willingness to dismiss the girl so easily. She had observed the peculiar sharpness in Hannah's eyes, the kind one finds in young women eager to rise above their station. That eagerness could make a person foolish or dangerous. It was not for nothing, Miss Marple thought, that Shakespeare had written so much of ambition. She tucked the thought away with the same delicacy she tucked a loose strand of wool into her knitting, not wishing to expose it too soon. Late in the afternoon, as the sky dulled into that washed-out grey which so often precedes an English drizzle, Miss Marple found herself in the grocer's, ostensibly buying sugar. There she overheard Mrs. Pembroke discussing the innkeeper's discovery of her keys. "In the sugar bin!" Mrs. Pembroke exclaimed, half scandalized, half delighted. Imagine! Keys of all things, hidden among sweet crystals. I told Arthur that very fact pointed to Mrs. Rowley's guilt. Why else would she tuck them away there? Unless she hoped to dissolve the evidence like sugar in tea? Miss Marple did not contradict her, though she thought to herself how very unlike Agnes Rowley it would be to stow anything in a place so untidy, so susceptible to contamination. Agnes prided herself on order. She could recall Agnes years ago, reproving a delivery boy who had left flour bags leaning untidily by the scullery wall. Pride in a place, Agnes had said, is the difference between a house and a hovel. No, Miss Marple mused. Someone else had put the keys in the sugar, and that someone knew enough of Agnes's habits to make the act appear plausible. That evening, Miss Marple took a stroll down the high street. She walked past the inn deliberately, pausing long enough to note the faintest outline of boots in the dirt by the scullery steps. They were smaller than a man's, narrow at the heel, sharp at the toe. Hannah's boots, perhaps, or some other village girl's? The ground had been disturbed by more recent feet, but Miss Marple, who had spent years observing the soft indentations of birds and cats in her own garden beds, knew the look of light steps from heavier ones. She took the detail as she always did, quietly storing it away, making no mention of it even to herself. The next day brought a new tremor of interest, for a letter arrived at the post office addressed to Leonard Pike. The handwriting was round and feminine, the envelope faintly scented with violets. The village, of course, did not wait for Sergeant Hawkes to open it officially. The mere knowledge of its arrival was enough to set tongues wagging. "A woman," said Mrs. Price Ridley with triumph. "I knew it. A man does not come all the way from Bristol without a woman being at the root of it." When Hawkes finally slit it open in the presence of Dr. Spencer and the postmaster, the contents proved underwhelming. A note of complaint about money not yet repaid, couched in delicate terms, but unmistakably the letter of a woman wronged. Hawkes muttered about debts and moneylenders. The villagers muttered about affairs of the heart. Miss Marple, alone at her tea-table, thought about the choice of violet scent. Not roses, not lavender, violets. A modest flower, preferred by modest women, though with a faintly old-fashioned air. Someone of a certain age, she decided, rather than a flighty girl. A woman in middle life, perhaps widowed or living under some restraint. She thought again of the blot on the register. A man waiting to decide which name he ought to write might also hesitate because of who might find him. The funeral was arranged for 3 days later, though few intended to follow the coffin. He was, after all, a stranger. The villagers were far more interested in observing Agnes, Hannah, and the police. On the morning of the funeral, the air hung heavy with rain, but the villagers still gathered in knots to watch the black cart creak down the road. Miss Marple attended not for the man himself, but for the living who walked behind him. Hannah did not cry. Agnes did, though hers were the tears of a woman overwhelmed by circumstance, not grief for the dead. Hawkes watched both with an unconvincing sternness that suggested he was no nearer an answer. That afternoon Miss Marple paid another call at the inn, ostensibly to bring Agnes a pot of beef tea. Agnes, tired and worn, accepted it gratefully. In the kitchen, Miss Marple allowed her eyes to wander. She saw the sugar bin now scrubbed and polished. She saw the scullery door, newly fitted with a stronger bolt, and she noticed something curious on the mantel, a scrap of blue paper half hidden under a vase. She bent to examine it, remarking casually on the flowers. "Carnations are cheerful," she said. "Yes," Agnes replied dully. "They were left from the party." The scrap of paper was the corner of a ticket, torn clean through. Miss Marple recognized it at once as a railway coupon, the kind given out when one purchased a return journey. So Mr. Leonard Pike, who had registered himself so neatly and carried so little, had bought a return. He had expected to leave again. Murder had not been on his schedule. That evening Miss Marple sat with her notebook again. She added a line, "Return ticket torn." Murderer wished him not to go. She looked at the earlier notes and saw them falling into a kind of order. The sugar, the erased register, the quick smile of Hannah, the watchfulness of Agnes, the scented letter, each was a thread. Not yet tied, but leading somewhere. She was reminded of her own knitting, where each row by itself seemed senseless, but the pattern revealed itself by patience and continuity. In the quiet of her parlour, she let her mind settle upon human nature, that great and often inconvenient guide. Murder was not committed for the unusual reasons that novels suggested, but for ordinary human motives: jealousy, money, shame, revenge. Which of these lay behind Leonard Pike's death? Miss Marple could not yet be certain, but she was beginning to suspect that the answer was simpler and nearer than anyone in the village yet supposed. And with that thought, she picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking steadily in the soft lamplight, as outside the rain began to fall, washing the high street clean, though never clean enough to erase what had already been done. The steady rain that had begun in the evening carried into the following morning, leaving the cobblestones slick and the hedgerows drooping under droplets. The village seemed muffled, as though scandal and weather had conspired together to draw curtains across every window. Yet gossip never sleeps, and in St. Aldwyn it thrived in whispers even when streets were deserted. Miss Marple, walking to the post office under the shelter of her umbrella, could hear snatches of conversation through half-open doors, words like sugar, keys, the maid, and that letter. She noted them without slowing her steps. For repetition, she knew, gave shape to truth in the same way raindrops carved a channel in stone. Inside the post office, the air was damp with the smell of coats hung too close to the stove. Mr. Finch looked harried. A trickle of villagers had gathered under the pretext of purchasing stamps or sending parcels, but their real intention was to learn whether more letters might arrive for the late Mr. Pike. Mr. Finch, trying to appear officious, explained again that no further correspondence had come. Yet his fingers fussed with the ledger, and his eyes darted toward the small locked drawer behind him. Miss Marple, after a pleasant word about the weather, observed the drawer with her usual mildness, and concluded that perhaps more had arrived than Finch was prepared to reveal until Hawkes gave permission. A prudent man, Finch, too prudent for his own comfort. As she left, she met Sergeant Hawkes himself striding up the street, his coat collar turned high. He greeted her respectfully but with an expression of fatigue. "Too many stories, Miss Marple," he said. "Every soul in this village thinks he knows more than the constable. Some say Pike was running from debt, others that he was pursuing some woman. I've no proof of either." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is seldom wise to dismiss the stories, Sergeant. They may be wrong in fact, but they are right in instinct. People sense what is out of place, though they often clothe it in fancy." Hawkes sighed. "Instinct won't stand in court. What I need is evidence," she smiled gently. "And yet evidence often hides behind instinct, waiting for the right hand to draw it out. Tell me, was the torn ticket found with the gentleman's effects?" Hawkes frowned. "Aye, in his valise, why?" "It is curious," Miss Marple replied. "Most men who travel with intent to vanish purchase a single ticket, but a return suggests confidence in the future. A man expecting to go home again seldom courts danger unless danger finds him." Hawkes looked at her, as though trying to decide how seriously to take such musings. But before he could answer, Mrs. Pembroke bustled past with her basket. She nodded at Miss Marple and leaned toward the sergeant with the air of conferring intelligence. "I saw Hannah last night at the butcher's. Bought more than her wages would allow, 2 chops, a marrow-bone, and sweat besides. Mark my words, Sergeant, she has money from somewhere, and I think it from him." She gave a knowing look and swept on, satisfied to have sown another seed. Miss Marple did not comment. Instead, she turned her steps toward the butcher's herself. It was true that Hannah had been spending more freely of late. One could tell by the bright ribbon in her hair, the new polish on her boots. Such small extravagances were noticed quickly in a place like St. Aldwyn. Inside the shop, Mr. Willis confirmed the purchase with a shrug. "She said her mother was poorly and fancied a rich broth," he explained. "Paid in coins, proper enough." Still, Miss Marple thought of the earlier excuse about her mother's sudden hunger for tea. Too many mothers, she reflected, were being called into Hannah's stories at the most convenient moments. By afternoon the rain had cleared. The air smelled of wet earth, and a soft mist lingered in the hollow by the churchyard. Miss Marple, walking there deliberately, paused by the fresh mound where Leonard Pike lay. It was not sentiment that guided her steps, but the knowledge that graves often became meeting places for the living, particularly when curiosity outweighed grief. She was not mistaken. Hannah soon appeared, carrying a posy of wildflowers too meagre for true mourning. She laid them quickly and looked about as if to ensure she had been seen. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a bench, pretended to adjust her knitting. The girl started when she noticed her, then forced a smile. "It's only respectful, ma'am," she said. "Quite so," Miss Marple answered. "Respect is never wasted, though sometimes it is used as a curtain. Flowers are a lovely thing, Hannah, but they cannot tell lies. People, alas, can." Hannah flushed, murmured something indistinct, and hurried away. Miss Marple watched her go with a thoughtful frown. The girl's nervousness was too sharp, her gestures too studied. If she had nothing to conceal, why seek so eagerly to be seen in virtue? That evening, as twilight pressed down and lamps began to glow behind lace curtains, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller. It was Agnes Rowley herself, pale and drawn, her hands twisting in her lap as she sat in Miss Marple's neat parlour. "I cannot sleep, Miss Marple," she confessed. "The villagers look at me as though I had blood upon my hands. I did not kill that man, but I fear I am undone all the same." Miss Marple poured her tea and listened with the patience of one accustomed to hearing more than was spoken. Agnes spoke of her debts, small but pressing, of her husband dead these 5 years, of the weariness of keeping an inn where strangers came and went without thought for the woman who served them. "He seemed ordinary," she said at last. "So very ordinary. Yet there was a sharpness in his eye as though he measured me with every glance. I disliked it. And now he is dead in my house, and I am the one suspected." Miss Marple set down her cup. "You are suspected because suspicion is easiest when a person is near. But proximity is not guilt. Tell me, Mrs. Rowley, do you recall if Mr. Pike posted a letter during his stay?" Agnes thought, then shook her head. "No. He asked once for writing paper, but he did not use it. At least I did not see it returned." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "A man with debts or obligations might be expected to write. Silence in such cases is sometimes louder than speech." After Agnes had gone, Miss Marple sat long by the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. She reviewed the threads once more, the erased name in the register, the torn ticket, the keys in the sugar, the scented letter, Hannah's sudden spending, Agnes's nervousness, the village's insatiable gossip. Each thread examined separately suggested a possible culprit. Yet she knew human nature well enough to suspect that the true pattern lay not in one thread alone, but in their intersection. The following morning brought a new disturbance. A stable boy cleaning the yard behind the inn found a length of twine dangling from the landing window. It was looped cunningly, as though meant to catch the latch and pull it down from outside. Hawks declared it proof of an intruder. The villagers nodded sagely, relieved to believe the killer had come from elsewhere. But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the twine with a different thought. She remembered her own words to the sergeant about such a trick, and how quickly it had now materialized. Too quickly, perhaps. She bent to examine it while no one watched. The twine was fresh, not weathered by days of rain. It had been placed only recently, after her own suggestion to Hawks, a convenient piece of evidence, appearing at the proper moment to divert suspicion. That, Miss Marple thought, was no accident. Someone had listened to her innocent observation and used it as cover. That someone had the wit to seize upon another's idea and make it their own. It was a dangerous kind of wit, the wit of a guilty mind. She straightened slowly, her eyes sweeping the yard. Hannah stood nearby, watching with feigned indifference as she polished the brass on the scullery door. Miss Marple tucked the detail away with quiet certainty. Hannah had heard her words that day, and Hannah had the ambition, the nervousness, and perhaps the reason to act. But motive, Miss Marple reminded herself, must be as plain as method. Until she uncovered why Leonard Pike had come to St. Aldwyn at all, the pattern could not yet be complete. She walked home through the brightening morning, her mind alive with possibilities. The village might chatter itself hoarse, hawks might blunder after footprints and rope, but Jane Marple knew that the truth was close, so close it almost breathed against her cheek. All that was needed now was patience, the quiet patience of one who understands that people, like knitting, reveal their pattern row by row. And she was prepared to wait, for she had never yet seen a pattern that failed to emerge. The morning after the loop of twine appeared, the village wore the comfortable look of people who think a story has kindly written its own conclusion. Miss Marple did not borrow their comfort. New string and a second-hand idea made a poor alibi. Someone had listened to her offhand suggestion and then arranged a proof of it. Tidy as a demonstration in a schoolroom. Doubts prefer errands, so she went first to Goose Lane. Hannah's cottage was briskly clean, geraniums standing to attention in scarlet pots. Mrs. Bell opened with a proud, guarded look that softened at the sight of Miss Marple's sensible hat. Inside the kitchen gleamed. A blue enamel teapot stood on the table, the brightness of a thing not yet scalded. Beside it lay a bone-handled knife still wearing the shine of newness. "What a handsome teapot," Miss Marple said, admiring the spout. "A gift?" "My girl," said Mrs. Bell with the proprietary pride of mothers. "Brought it Saturday." "Saturday was a generous day," Miss Marple murmured. "One hears you took tea at 1 o'clock for your health." "My digestion has kept 4:30 for 30 years," Mrs. Bell answered, too promptly to be rehearsed. She heard herself and coloured. She meant well. "Kindness does not mind inspection," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "The air should have held the ghost of broth if a marrow bone had simmered. It held instead paraffin and starch." She asked for a glass of water to swallow a fictitious tablet, and while Mrs. Bell went to the pump, stepped to the dresser. A folded handkerchief there bore a faint smear of violet pomade at one corner. "Miss Barton sends her cards with that scent," Mrs. Bell said when she returned, eyes quick to where Miss Marple's attention had strayed. "For fittings and lessons, violets again." Miss Marple tucked the hint away. A letter to Leonard Pike had been scented so. It was useful to know the habit had a local supply. From Goose Lane she crossed to the post office to buy paper fasteners she did not need. Mr. Finch was alone, which simplified matters. Miss Marple set down a sixpence and let a shilling roll neatly into the gap behind the pigeonholes. Mr. Finch, apologizing, lifted the counter flap and burrowed where coin and dust collect. The small locked drawer had to be opened. He slid it out, and Miss Marple's eyes, which had never been accused of rudeness, read what politeness could not ask. A packet, loosely tied, covered several envelopes. The uppermost was addressed to Mr. Pye, Chow the King's Arms. Beneath it lay another in a fine round hand, faintly rhymed with violet scent. To Mr. Leonard Pike. Mr. Finch recovered the shilling and his dignity. "Wet weather," he said. "Coins are slippery." "The weather will have its way," Miss Marple agreed, bought her useless fasteners and stepped into the square with knowledge that made the air lighter and heavier at once. The dead man expected letters under 2 spellings. The blot and eraser crumbs in the register had already whispered as much. Pike Pie. Some men alter a letter as other men alter a hat. She found Sergeant Hawkes on the green interrogating a boot mark with solemn dissatisfaction. He listened, surprised but not unwilling, as she told him of the envelopes and of Miss Barton's association with violets. "You might take the letters now, Sergeant," she suggested in gentle deference, "and perhaps a word with Miss Barton before the afternoon post affords her more things to think about than music." Hawkes promised action. Miss Marple went herself to Miss Barton's rooms, because policemen collect facts and old ladies are sometimes given truths. The rooms were orderly and smelt of good soap with a delicate overtone of sweetness. A cut-glass bottle of violet cologne stood upon the mantel like a modest confession. Miss Barton, a woman a little past 40 with the tidy gravity of a ledger, received her with a nervous courtesy that could not quite hide distress. "I have a niece who wants lessons," Miss Marple began, and they spoke for a few minutes of scales, patience and the obstinacy of small fingers. When Miss Barton's hands had slowed from their anxious flutter, Miss Marple let a thoughtful pause fall and said, as though noticing a trifle, "So unfortunate about the gentleman at the inn. I saw a letter to him scented with your perfume. Violet is popular, I suppose." Miss Barton's fingers closed and opened, like a metronome set a notch too fast. "Many shops stock it," she said. Then, with an effort at steadiness, "I once wrote to an address in Bristol, years ago. It was a foolishness, and it is ended. Paper ends more readily than people," Miss Marple answered kindly. She rose. As she turned, she noticed beneath the piano stool a fine shaving of blue paper, the curl left by a ticket torn clean. "These little railway scraps do travel," she remarked. Miss Barton said too quickly, "A pupil must have dropped it." On the stair, Miss Marple met Hannah coming up with a parcel from the ironmonger. "Strings for the violins," the girl said brightly. The ironmonger did not keep strings. He kept twine and screws. Miss Marple smiled with equal brightness and less belief. By evening, it was agreed in the village that Hawkes had prized the letters from Mr. Finch. The one to Mr. Pye contained a money order, receipt and 3 curt lines, as arranged. Next installment upon proof. The violet note to Mr. Pike, already known, pressed for the repayment of a hopeful loan. 2 names, 2 tones, and 1 man who watched the clock and chose the hearth. What had such a man come to St. Aldwyn to collect? If it were only money, he might have asked by post. Proof lives where people do, in cupboards and memories and faces. Miss Marple thought of the chair by the hearth facing the bar, of the question about the bell, of the return ticket in his valise, and of the small, deliberate blot upon the register. A collector of proof waits where a subject must pass, and takes care to be present at the right strike of the hour. The next morning she carried a jar of quince jelly to the inn. Agnes accepted it with gratitude, whose simplicity made it trustworthy. In the tap-room, Miss Marple let her handkerchief slip beside the settle, where she had once seen a blue curl. Stooping, she found a litter of blackened match ends swept imperfectly beneath the skirting. Too burned to catch one flame is a maid's impatient extravagance. Hannah came in as Miss Marple knelt and, seeing what lay there, flushed and vanished again. "You keep things very bright," Miss Marple said to Agnes. "Miss Barton is said to be particular as well." "Hannah is quick," Agnes answered, as if quickness were an unalloyed virtue. She twisted the chain at her waist, recently rehung with the recovered keys. "Sergeant Hawkes says the window was worked from outside. He showed me the string. Demonstrations are very persuasive," Miss Marple said. "The difficulty is that once people have seen a trick, anyone may perform it." Back at home she opened her small notebook and wrote, "Name divided, Pike, Pye. Debt divided, Hope, proof. Violet fear-scented, twine placed after suggestion. Matches, haste." She studied the list until the items ceased to be solitary and began to lean together. Fear would belong to a woman whose position could be easily harmed. Proof suggests a past that will not lie still. Haste belongs to youth. Ambition often dresses itself as helpfulness. There remained the parish theatre, Mrs. Price Ridley, who believed no girl under 20 had virtue and no woman over 40 had sin except in committees, and Colonel Brabazon, who believed the reverse. Miss Marple paid each a short call to hear, not what they knew but what they assumed. Between those assumptions, a true woman might be pressed into secrecy. At dusk she passed the dressmakers and paused in the doorway. Through the glass, Miss Barton was refolding ribbon with a precision that trembled. On a peg behind her hung a serviceable black coat with a hem newly turned. A thrifty woman, then, who would feel £2 lent and not repaid. Down the lane, Hannah crossed the candle-lit patch of window, quick and intent. The figure of a girl who had learned to perform usefulness because usefulness was the only stage offered her. The 2 women did not see each other, but their paths made a silent angle in the street. Miss Marple went home and warmed milk against the damp. She had not the answer, but she had the posture of it, a place to stand and a direction to look. If Leonard Pike or Pye had come for proof, St. Aldwyn held some fact about a woman that had been agreed upon in silence and now required payment. Proof might be a letter, a ticket stub, a date that did not match, a face that did. Violet belongs to modesty, ambition to youth, and both can be frightened into folly by a man with two names and a return in his pocket. She slept lightly and woke with a simple resolve to watch the hour. Bells do not only call people to church, they call them to mistakes. When the bar clock marked 1, she took her shawl and sat where the inn door, the post office, and the dressmaker's could all be seen by an old woman feeding sparrows. The street drowsed until Hannah came out with a folded parcel and turned not toward the butcher, as she had told Agnes, but toward the dressmaker's steps. At the same instant, Miss Barton came down with a sealed envelope, saw Hannah, and stopped. The stop was only a heartbeat. Then each went on, passing without a word and pretending other errands. It was nothing and it was everything. A tiny misstep at the very hour a dead man had chosen to watch. Miss Marple went home satisfied with very little, because little was exactly what the truth likes, to wear before it is ready to be seen. The hour after, Miss Marple watched the two women pass brought the village into a held-breath calm that was not peace so much as a pause between movements. For everyone today, truly. She went indoors, wound her clock, for she never trusted the bar clock, and pinned a slip in her notebook. At 1 o'clock, a mistake. Morning came pale after rain. With a basket of scones and no declared question, she walked to the vicarage. Mrs. Weatherby met her at the gate, fluttering. "My dear Miss Marple, you are providential." The vestry, someone has been at the parish books. In the vestry the air held the leathery smell of bindings. The baptisms register lay with its ribbon displaced. A thin shaving had been taken from a page and pressed back not quite true. Grey crumbs from an india rubber dotted the margin. "Paper remembers," Miss Marple murmured. The vicar wrung his hands. "Monstrous. What possible good, earthly good," she said. "The baptismal entry may be an inconvenient truth or a convenient silence." Sergeant Hawkes arrived, comforted by splinters rather than guesses. "A tramp, likely." "Tramps are not fastidious," Miss Marple replied. "They do not tidy margins or reconsider dates." Mrs. Weatherby remembered, as kind souls remember consequential things like recipes. "Only last week Miss Barton looked at the registers," she said, "for a christening lace motif. I fetched the book and left her when the barley sugar needed me." Hawkes brightened at a name. "Direction is a tonic to certain minds." Miss Marple lingered long enough to coax a pale crescent of blue ticket paper from under the lectern foot. Unimportant, save that it proved the sea had been here. Hawkes returned from Miss Barton's with contradiction. She admitted looking at the books, denied pen or knife, confessed a small loan to a Mr. Pike in Bristol, and one letter urging repayment. Then she wept tidily. Miss Marple, calling later with a shawl that had somehow needed mending, asked for a needle, and was shown the work table. In the drawer lay an india rubber faintly blued as by railway pencil, and a penknife with the guilty shine of new sharpening. Miss Barton closed the drawer as one shuts a door on a room not fit to show. "I only copied the border," she said. "Villages say things until they become true." "Which is why one must be particular about the first speaker," Miss Marple said. On the pavement she met Hannah, brisk as a girl walking away from 3 small lies and toward one large hope. "Agnes wants me," Hannah announced. "The brewery man comes to inspect the bottles." It was the sort of errand that lets a maid feel necessary to the skeleton of a house. Importance makes hands clumsy. By 3 the brewery man had come and gone, and Miss Marple took a quiet seat in the taproom with lemon barley water that said exactly what it was. Agnes moved with a steadiness so managed it looked fierce. Hannah counted bottles and lost her place. A stranger entered then, not the kind who becomes scenery. Soft hat, careful neutrality, ginger beer. He stood where clock and door were both under his eye. When the bar clock struck, he drew a brown envelope half out and showed Hannah the corner, like a conjurer showing the first card. Nothing changed hands. An understanding did. Hannah's glance skated to Agnes and away. She gave a little nod. He went out by the yard. Miss Marple did not move. Agnes, sensing a tremor at the edge of her kingdom, called Hannah back to count glassware. The call sounded like rescue, though neither would have named it so. That evening Hawkes brought a brown envelope to Miss Marple's cottage, looking both satisfied and defeated. "Pushed through the post-box without a stamp," he said. "Proof, perhaps." Inside lay a glossy seaside photograph, Leonard Pike with a girl of 16 at his arm. On the back, in tidy feminine hand, "A day at Weston with Uncle Leonard. H.B. Summer." The year had been scraped. The initials remained. "H.B. could be half the women hereabouts," Hawkes said. "Or one," Miss Marple answered. "Hannah Bell." People are consistent in how they try to erase what they regret. "If Pike," Hawkes began, "if he collected girls as other men collect receipts," Miss Marple said, "he likely kept the receipts as well. The question is which woman feared what proof and who, seeing opportunity, used it. Miss Barton fears shame. Agnes fears ruin," Hawkes muttered. "And the girl?" "Being small," Miss Marple said. "Girls who fear smallness do large foolish things. Watch their hours. Watch their hands when they lie." After he had gone, she held the photograph to the lamp. The girl's collar had a scallop she had seen, or thought she had, on washing days behind Goose Lane. Uncle Leonard's smile was practiced. She pinned a new line beneath her first. At 3 o'clock a rehearsal. Then she wrote, "Who pushed the envelope and why no stamp?" A man with a return ticket affixes stamps. An unposted truth suggests a local sender who wished to seem accidental. Morning brought another disquiet. The vicar sent word a blue counterfoil from the Fate raffle book was missing from the vestry desk. Miss Marple went down and found, in the basket beneath, a few lace threads and the faintest breath of violets where none should be. Violets were modest, but they travelled. Mrs. Bell's dresser handkerchief, Miss Barton's mantle bottle, 1 cent 2 doors. At one she took up her station, where door, post office and dressmakers made a gentle triangle. The bell chimed. Mr. Finch shook his mat. Miss Barton appeared with an envelope, saw Hannah and stopped a breath too long. That breath offered to the past belongs to the present. Hannah looked frightened rather than guilty, which told Miss Marple the girl was in something she had not chosen, and that someone steadied her from behind. The sensible thing would have been to announce a conclusion. Sensible things rarely fit people. Miss Marple went home and waited. People who practice small erasures almost always attempt a larger remedy at the last. That is human nature's arithmetic. Dusk had scarcely settled when Mrs. Weatherby called from the lane that Miss Barton had been found in her workroom, with the window open, the room tossed, her hands trembling. Miss Marple arrived to find disorder with an organized look, the sort of mess that knows it is being watched. Drawers gaped an inch. The penknife drawer gaped not at all. "A thief," Miss Barton said. "I cannot say what is missing." On the sill a fresh thread of twine was snagged like a thought on a nail. "Windows make excellent stages for intruders," Miss Marple said. Miss Barton flushed and wept in the small, tidy way again. Hawkes called it another outrage by the same hand. Miss Marple watched the dressmaker's fingers open and close like a metronome, set a notch too fast, and thought not of hands, but of hours. 1 o'clock had produced hesitation. 3 had produced rehearsal. Dusk, she felt, would produce decision. The pattern was nearly ready to declare itself. It was time to lay a thread of her own, where an ambitious girl and a tidy woman might each be tempted to pick it up and, by pulling, show what they most wished to hide. Miss Marple set her thread with the same quiet care she used to hem an awkward seam, choosing her lure, her hour, and her stage. The lure would be a sliver of blue ticket. The hour the drowsy half-afternoon. The stage the bar clock at the King's Arms, because people hide near what is already watched, and because Agnes had said the clock gained 3 minutes when the fire was lively. After breakfast, she walked in a way designed to be remembered as chance. At the post office she bought nothing worth buying, and remarked to Mr. Finch, as one might to an old friend, that clocks were admirable for keeping secrets. At the dressmaker's she praised a newly turned hem and, as if idly, observed that the vicar had recovered a missing raffle counterfoil behind a panel, of all places, and that he meant to send for it after 2. She left the faint idea where she wished it to live, then went on to the inn with a jar of quince jelly and a request for hot water. By 1 o'clock the village was primed without knowing it. She took the bench opposite the inn and fed the sparrows in a rhythm that made patience visible. Inside, Agnes moved among bottles with a steadiness so managed it looked fierce. Hannah went up and down the stair with a purposeful rustle. At 5 past, Miss Barton appeared at the far end of the street, hat plain, step small, attention large. She paused to read the bill of fare and measured the room with a glance that wished to be casual. Hannah, coming down with a tray, half smiled, and then looked at the clock. At 10 past, Sergeant Hawkes turned the corner with the unfortunate look of a man who grows more official the more he tries not to. Miss Barton saw him at once, lowered her head, and walked on as if she had always meant to be elsewhere. Thus deprived of a cue, Hannah hesitated and vanished into the passage. Miss Marple rose with the serenity of a woman whose day has been arranged by others. She crossed to the tap-room. "Dear Agnes, I wonder," she said, "may I tuck my umbrella behind the clock? It will drip and be a nuisance." Agnes, amused against her will, consented. The little rear panel, one of those domestic contrivances a housekeeper knows, opened to honest dust. Miss Marple made a show of nesting her umbrella there, and in doing so, let fall the torn edge of a common railway ticket she had acquired from Mr. Finch with the air of needing it to steady a wobbly table. It drifted down between panel and shelf like a quiet idea choosing its corner. She thanked Agnes and went out as if nothing had happened. Hawkes, puzzled, touched his hat. Miss Barton, across the way, admired a notice about piano tuners with rather heroic attention. Hannah, white-lipped now, polished a surface that did not require polishing. People cannot guard against what they do not see themselves doing. At 1/4 past, no one moved. At 20 past, Miss Barton decided the notice was dull and walked on, the careful step of the cautiously defeated. At 22 past, Hannah slipped into the tap-room passage. At 25 she came out with a cluster of empties and went straight to the scullery. At 27 the curtain breathed a fraction and fell still. Miss Marple did not stir. Waiting is a polite form of pressure. Few bear it well. The pressure told on Hannah first. She returned to the bar with an air of chivying usefulness, reached to dust the clock, hesitated, reached again and pulled the panel. Her fingers brushed blue. She snatched the slip, thrust it into her apron pocket, and turning saw Miss Marple in the doorway with the gentlest expression it is possible to wear when one has seen everything. The girl dropped the paper as if it burned. Agnes came from the back, alarm in her eyes. "What are you doing, child?" she asked, a tremor under the steadiness. "Dust," Hannah said in a voice that had to cross a desert. Hawkes, drawn as if by a string, arrived at the threshold. He saw the scrap by Hannah's shoe and stooped. "It is no proof," Miss Marple said mildly. "Only a rehearsal of proof. May we all sit a moment?" The suggestion was so unexpected that they obeyed. Agnes and Hannah took the settle. Hawkes hovered by the hearth, and Miss Marple sat as a schoolmistress might, when a lesson is to be got through without tempers. "I do not know everything," she began. "I do not know whether Mr. Pike first came to collect money or secrecy. I suspect he collected both as occasion offered. He was tidy in his way. He had 2 names for 2 moods. When he came to you, Miss Barton, he was Leonard Pike, the nephew or friend who charmed a small loan and promised to repay when business mended. When he came to you, She inclined her head to Hannah. He was Mr. Pye, who keeps photographs of seaside afternoons and charges £1 to forget them. Hannah made a small sound like a bird striking glass. Photographs are unpleasant things in unkind hands, Miss Marple went on. Harder to argue with than talk. He had one taken at Weston, the sort a girl keeps a week and forgets unless reminded. It is not a crime to be foolish at 16. There are men who live on such foolishness. Agnes drew in her breath. Hannah? She is not wicked, Miss Marple said quickly. She is afraid. Fear often looks like cleverness from within. She did not kill him. Hawkes cleared his throat. Then who did? That I am not yet ready to say, Miss Marple answered, and the frankness disarmed him. But I can tell you who arranged the string at the window after I'd given the idea, and who worried at the parish register, with an india rubber scented faintly of violets, and who wept in tidy, little tears because that is her habit. Miss Barton, though absent, seemed to sit among them by the force of those particulars. Why would she? Hawkes asked. Because tidy women are sometimes the bravest cowards, Miss Marple said softly. They cannot bear a mess, even of reputation. Years ago, one sees the year scraped from the photograph, there was a trouble. It concerned a name on a page, and a date not easily fitted to it. A woman did something unwise to make it fit, perhaps called a child niece who was nearer. Then along came a gentleman who liked proof. He waited by the hearth because the person he wanted must pass the bar clock, and because that clock, quickened by heat, runs a little ahead. Agnes frowned. What does that matter? It matters because the church bell struck one at its honest time, but your clock, warmed by the fire, would have reached it first. A person meaning to meet Mr. Pye at the exact moment might have come early without meaning to. 3 minutes can make two people occupy the same square of air who never meant to. Many mischiefs are born of 3 minutes. It was not an accusation. It was a picture. It hung in the quiet. At last Hannah whispered, I didn't mean I only wanted the photograph. He said he would bring it at 1 and give it me for £1. Miss Barton said... She stopped and bit her lip. She told you were foolish and that she would fetch it herself, Miss Marple finished. And perhaps she did. And perhaps she and Mr. Pye had words by the hearth, and perhaps words became hands, and perhaps he fell. But these are perhapses. We shall not build on them. We shall wait for proof, and meanwhile we shall be careful with the hours. They are more dangerous than knives. She rose and by rising loosed them. Hawkes stood straighter, greedy for the end. Agnes set a hand on Hannah's shoulder and did not remove it. Miss Marple went out where the cobbles looked newly washed. The village breathed, because someone had said aloud what it had almost thought. She did not smile. Her thread now lay where 2 hands might take hold, the brave cowards and the frightened clever girls. When either pulled, the pattern would show. She had not gone 10 steps before Mrs. Price Ridley intercepted her, triumph bright as pins in a hat. I always said there was a woman, she declared, and another besides. I told Colonel Brabazon at breakfast that Hannah has been too tidy for her place. Tidy girls always have secrets. Miss Marple, who knew tidy girls often have only pride, murmured agreement and passed on. The murmur fed Mrs. Price Ridley's need and starved her interference. In the evening Hawkes came to the cottage with a brown envelope, pushed through the stationer's slot without a stamp. Inside lay the Weston photograph, Leonard Pike with a girl at his arm, and a second thing, a stub of return ticket, Bristol to Compton Bishop, torn in the same manner as the blue curl she had dropped behind the clock. From a friend, the outer read. Hawkes looked hopeful and thwarted at once. Proof? He asked. Not yet, said Miss Marple. A confession of nerves. Someone is tidying the past in a hurry, and wishes us to tidy with them. We have been wrong in the order of our hours. We speak as if the meeting were at 1 by the church, when for our players the bar time ruled. Whoever arranged the scene counted by that face, not by the bell. There is something that happens between those 3 minutes that no one has told us. Tomorrow, Sergeant, you will borrow the clock. Borrow it? "You will take it to the vicarage to be compared," she said, "and you will leave word of it in 2 places where it will be overheard correctly. The person who needs those minutes will not sleep with the mechanism absent. They will come for it, and in coming will tell us which fear is stronger, exposure or prudence." Hawkes liked having a thing to do. After he left, Miss Marple set her own clock, wrote in her book, "Pull on the hours. Watch who runs," and douse the lamp. She sat a while in the lamplight's after-image, thinking of women who tidy their lives too tightly, and girls who mistake fear for cleverness, and of a man with 2 names who chose a hearth because it warms a clock. Outside, St. Aldwyn settled like a cat deciding where to sleep. Inside, Miss Marple did not. She listened to the slow, stout tick and pictured the gap where the bar clock would have been, and in that imagined silence heard the sound people make when they cannot bear to wait, feet going somewhere they promised themselves they would not go. Morning came brittle and bright, the sort of light that makes everything look honest whether it deserves it or not. Sergeant Hawkes arrived at the King's Arms with a carpenter's bag and the grave politeness of a man borrowing the village's heartbeat. Agnes watched while he lifted the bar clock down, wrapped it in sacking and wrote a receipt as though the clock might object to its removal. "Comparison with the vicar's chronometer," he announced, loud enough for the doorway and the pavement beyond. "A trifle slow, then fast. We'll have it regulated." The words wandered out into St. Aldwyn and settled in every kitchen like seed. Miss Marple stood a little aside, her hands folded on the head of her umbrella. "How empty a corner looks," she murmured, as Hawkes bore the bundle away. "Empty places make people remember what they put there. That shelf will feel queer," Agnes said, rubbing the pale ring left by generations of dusting around the clock's feet. "I shall think I've forgotten something." "Most mischief begins with the feeling that something has been forgotten," Miss Marple replied. "Let us see what comes to fetch its memory." They did not call it a trap. To name a snare is to teach timid creatures to keep away. Hawkes crossed the green carrying the clock like a ceremonial loaf. Miss Marple let the vacancy do its quiet work. She took her knitting to the pew beneath the north window, a vantage from which the lich gate, the post office door, and the narrow lane behind the inn could all be observed without appearing to look. The vicar, apprised of their little charade, fretted as decent men do and offered tea. Miss Marple declined, set her spectacles on her nose, and counted stitches, which is a social way of counting people. By noon the village had made the clock's absence into a story. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it indelicate to leave a respectable shelf bare. Colonel Brabazon pronounced all clocks untrustworthy since Waterloo, and marched away reconciled to history. Hannah moved briskly but badly, the way a girl moves when she is counting breaths rather than steps. Miss Barton did not appear, which was itself a kind of movement. At 12:30 the post office produced a ripple. Mr. Finch, resigned to serving as conduit for every current, sent word that a telegram had arrived addressed to Pye. Hawkes read it in the vestry with the solemn satisfaction of a man handed a lever. Tuesday, 3 o'clock. "Bring proof, no delays." J. He tapped the paper. "Our dead gentleman was a wheel in a larger cart." Or J is a letter meant to sound like a man, Miss Marple said. "Fear likes a timetable. 3 o'clock Tuesday, we shall be at home to callers." When she stepped out again, the air had altered. A small draught crossed the stones like an intake of breath. Through the gate came Miss Barton, gloved and neat, bearing a brown paper parcel tied with string that looked too new for second use. She started at the sight of Miss Marple, and turned the start into a smile. "How punctual the vicar is about clocks," she said. "Punctuality is a cousin to conscience," Miss Marple observed. "You are kind to bring parcels to the church." "A cover for Mrs. Weatherby's hymn book," Miss Barton replied, but when she reached the porch, she hesitated, and in hesitation a person's footprint shows. "I shall leave it here," she decided, laying the parcel carefully on the settle as one lays gilt on a neutral surface. She looked through Miss Marple toward the nave, quick as a thief measuring distance, "Do you find the absence of the bar clock inconvenient?" Miss Marple asked very mildly. Miss Barton's smile thinned. "Clocks are to be consulted, not loved," she said, and took herself away in a straight line that convinced nobody. Hawkes, who had watched from the vestry door, shifted his weight. "Shall I follow?" "Only with your ears," Miss Marple said. "People who tidy their own trails make a sound like sweeping. Listen for that." At 1, Agnes served a modest luncheon to a modest trade. Without the clock, the room sounded different. Glasses clicked in a key without a tonic. Hannah made an inventory error and almost wept over her arithmetic, which told more truth than tears. Miss Marple asked for hot water and took the corner chair that gave her a parson's view. Nothing rose from the empty niche. Nothing went into it. Absence performed like a well-trained actor. That, too, was a lesson. When fear does not rush to fill a gap, it is waiting for a cue. At 2, Hawkes loosened the clocks back in the vicarage attic. He had no plan beyond obedience, which in this case was enough. In the cavity behind the mechanism lay a folded sheet of cheap notepaper and a second older thing, the blue-edged corner of a certified copy, creased to fit the hollow. He brought both down as if he had surprised a bird. He hid his nerve under the skin of the house, he said, placing the fines on the vestry table. "What does the note say?" Miss Marple asked, though she could already see its shape in the sergeant's face. He read, "3 minutes is enough. At the hearth. Bring the copy or I tell J. Tsahele." He rubbed the paper with his thumb as men rub coins. So there is the mechanism as well as the method. He counted on the clock and on the fear of whoever owned that copy. "And someone will recount now that the clock is away," Miss Marple said. "They will count in their head, which is louder. Put them in your pocket, Sergeant, and come down." Attics encourage melodrama. Word of the clock's journey reached every parlour by 3. Mr. Finch stood in his doorway with envelopes. He did not need to sort. Mrs. Price Ridley took a bench and knitted a square that would never become a blanket. The lane behind the inn accepted 2 boys with a kite and a moral purpose. Agnes polished the same point on the bar until it shone like conscience. Hannah polished 2 until the wood blurred. At 5 minutes to 3, Miss Barton returned. She had lost enough colour to make her powder plain. In her hand, not the parcel now, but a flat packet bound with tape, the sort of object that can be bowed into a bodice without showing. She went not to the inn door but to the yard passage, as if a different entrance might offer a different truth. Miss Marple rose and drifted that way also, pausing where old brick keeps counsel with itself. In the narrow shade of the passage, sound grew shy and time condensed. Miss Barton stopped beneath the landing window, because that is where people stop when they have planned to, even if the plan has been unmade. Hannah came from the scullery with a bucket and halted because Miss Barton filled the square exactly. Their eyes met on equal fear. Miss Marple remained quite invisible, because smallness is an art and she had practiced it long. "Have you brought it?" Hannah asked in a rush that wanted to be bravery. "I am not giving it to you," Miss Barton whispered, and for the first time Miss Marple heard iron under tidiness. "You would spend your life to purchase an hour. I will speak to the sergeant and to Mrs. Rowley. We will make it right. Right?" Hannah's laugh scratched. "He said I could never be right. Not after Weston. Not after the date. He said there is a man, Jay, who will tell Agnes and the vicar and everyone. I cannot bear it. The man is dead," Miss Barton said, "and Jay writes telegrams to ghosts. Give me the photograph, child." Hannah stepped back, the bucket swinging. Water slopped and clattered against the flags. Above them the landing window rattled under a draught. The sound was simple. The memory it called was not. Miss Marple saw almost as a picture. The hearth, the clock 3 minutes fast. A woman with a folded copy against her stays. A girl arriving early. A man conducting 2 frightened hearts. Words at the wrong pitch, a reach. The quick, corrupt arithmetic of panic. Miss Barton reached out. Hannah flinched. The taped packet, tugged between good intention and fear, slipped and sailed like a book trying air toward the wet stones. Miss Marple stepped with the neat economy of a house cat and caught it before it learned to fall. "Shall we not show Sergeant Hawkes together?" she said, as if proposing a hymn. Miss Barton let her hands drop. Hannah turned her face to the wall. They went into the tap-room, where Agnes, hearing voices with more meaning than volume, closed the door and stood with her back to it, as if guarding both the inn and the village at once. Hawkes came at Miss Marple's message, bringing the vicar because righteousness sometimes serves as paperwork. On the bar, Miss Marple undid the tape. Inside lay the certified copy of a baptism, a child born in Bristol, an inconvenient date, a father's name replaced by a dash. Beneath it, the Western photograph in duplicate, one with the year laboriously scraped and the other untouched. "There is the tidy past," Miss Marple said, "and the messy present." "You were trying to make them agree." Miss Barton's voice was low but steady. "I sent money to keep a mouth closed years ago," she said. "Not for myself. For someone who trusted me. When this man came to verify, he pressed for the paper and for more. He wrote to me as Mr. Pike and to her," her eyes flicked toward Hannah, "as Mr. Pye. He arranged the meeting at 1 to catch us both. I went to stop it. He showed me how the clock ran ahead and laughed. He caught at my sleeve when I turned to go, slipped, and struck his head by the grate. I meant to scream. I didn't. I thought of the church book and the copy and tidied. I am ashamed," Hannah cried. "I never touched him. I only wanted the picture back. He said if I didn't pay, Jay would tell my mother I was wicked. I saved my wages, I did." "Jay," Hawkes muttered, turning the telegram. "Who is Jay?" "A letter men use when they wish to be many," Miss Marple said. "Or one more wolf for a pack. We shall meet him on Tuesday if he exists, and if he does not, we shall be tidier than he deserves." She folded the papers and placed them in Hawkes's hand. Meanwhile, the clock. Hawkes looked at the empty niche and then at Agnes. "Return it?" "Let it run honest," Miss Marple said. "We have no further use for minutes that arrive early." When the clock was set back upon its shelf, the room exhaled. The hands took up their good ordinary duty. Agnes, who had not sat in 2 days, sat. Outside, the village received the picture of time restored, and believed both more and less than the truth. Miss Marple stepped into the street with Hawkes, the thin sun warming her shawl. "Sergeant," she said, "if Jay is a man, he will come because habit makes him bold. If Jay is a letter for several men, one will come because greed makes him punctual. Either way, 3 o'clock has been promised." Hawkes nodded, pocket heavy with papers. "You think the death was an accident?" he asked. "I think death rarely travels without fear beside it," Miss Marple said. "We know the fear that brought him here. We must learn which fear will bring the next." Tuesday arrived bright, and yet the village stepped softly, as though a raised voice might disturb the hour it had been promised. Agnes polished the brass until it threw back a second inside the first. Hannah kept to the kitchen, where practical motion could pass for courage. Miss Barton hemmed a blouse with stitches so orderly they seemed to apologize. The bar clock, restored to its niche, ticked in an unshowy key. Sergeant Hawkes, faithful to their small contrivance, had announced publicly that it would be compared with the vicar's chronometer, and then returned, which is what had been done. Miss Marple asked one concession only: no coal on the fire from 2:30 to 3, so the clock would keep the church's truth. "If we are to meet a habit," she told Agnes, "let it find us punctual in the old-fashioned way." Agnes agreed, grateful for orders that felt like housekeeping. At 20 to 3, the inn played ordinary life with the anxious neatness of a troupe reviewed by critics. 2 carriers drank ginger beer and advice. Colonel Brabazon took a half of bitter, and declared that brigands respect a firm chin. Mrs. Price Ridley sailed past twice, perfectly ready to be invited in and not being invited. Hannah brought Miss Marple hot water and managed, "if he comes," without naming him. The church bell lifted its voice for the quarter. Outside, a cart creaked as though time itself were arriving by axle. At 3 minutes to the hour, a man entered, who had been designed to be forgotten. Decent suit, decent shave, no feature a neighbour could be persuaded to recall. He removed his hat, ordered ginger beer, and took the judicious station Mr. Pye had favoured, between hearth and door, where the clock could be consulted and the back politely protected. Hawkes did not know him. Agnes did not know him. Miss Marple knew his type. 3 o'clock, he observed, with the entitlement of someone who expects time to salute him. Appointments kept? With the living, Agnes said quietly, and he revised her. He smiled like men smile who never sign anything. A pity about Mr. Pye, he went on. He was thorough. Thorough men keep receipts, copies, photographs. His eyes slid to Hannah with the tidy arithmetic of an invoice. Fortunately, thoroughness can be transferred. I'm here for an interested party. Call him J. Or call him a letter, Miss Marple said, letting her voice wander into the talk like a cat through a door left ajar. People who travel under initials seldom care to trouble parish registers. He measured her and moved on. And you are Aunt Jane, Colonel Brabazon announced with bluster intended as protection. The lady misses nothing and says less. Agnes set both hands on the bar. No papers leave my house except with the sergeant. In a housekeeper's mouth it sounded like an oath. Jameson's smile remained. His eyes cooled. He died under your roof, he said. People find that persuasive. They find it tiresome, Miss Marple answered. She watched the small muscles where certainty lives, the corner of the mouth, the blink that arrives after its cue. Hawkes unfolded the telegram. You wrote this. My client dictated the sense, Jameson said smoothly. He edged half an inch toward the hearth, aligning himself with an old map. Miss Marple let silence ripen. People talk to the version of themselves they prefer when quiet is offered. He filled it at last. 3 minutes can be very useful, he remarked. Not today, said Miss Marple. Our fire is low. We keep on as time. He flinched at the pin. Cleverness is always inconvenienced by old habits properly kept. The church clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3. Jameson's hand drifted to his inner pocket, slow, and returned with an unaddressed envelope. He laid it on the bar with a courteous finger. Consider, he told Agnes in a voice meant for coins. Respectability is dearer than paper. Agnes did not touch it. Respectability is like brass, she said. You do not buy it. You keep it clean. Hawkes opened the envelope, a blank sheet, stage property and nothing else. Enough, the sergeant said with the tone of a man who has been mocked once and not twice. To the station. Gladly, Jameson replied, smiling at Miss Marple as at a partner in a longer game. You will discover all clocks keep Jay's time. He allowed himself to be escorted between Colonel Brabazon and the barman, who had unexpectedly acquired the dimensions of a wardrobe. The inn breathed. Hannah sagged. Agnes steadied her with a hand that shook after it had done its duty. Mrs. Price Ridley arranged the pavement into a moral and claimed it. Miss Marple resumed her seat and her knitting. The needles clicked like quiet thought. Hawkes returned within the hour, not with a confession, but with a small tin box fetched from Jameson's respectable lodging at the Blue Boar in Compton Bishop. Predators choose neighbouring villages for their beds. Inside lay 3 calling cards with different names, a money order book prinked with sums and blanks, and a penciled plan of the King's Arms door, bar hearth, landing window with little arrows for sightlines and times. An engineer of fear, Miss Marple said, tracing the drawn route to the yard. He does not invent terror. He arranges it. The hand that drew the plan leaned and hurried. Mr. Pye's neat upright letters had not. Partners, she added, but not twins. A quarrel about shares would quicken a man to collect a loan. What now? Asked Hawkes. Now we watch for the second appointment, said Miss Marple. When the post is dull enough to be noticed by its dullness. Tomorrow before noon. Put a constable in the telegraph office and ask Mr. Finch to be slow with small coins. Slowness is the best sieve I know. And you? I shall look for a tidy hand that dislikes blue paper, she said. The corner behind the clock, belonged to a certified copy folded very small. Another blue stub. The Bristol to Compton Bishop return came from Jameson's box. There should be a Bristol to St. Aldwyn stub. We have not found it. Someone who tidies from principal removed it. When I know which tidy hand that is, I shall know which truth still refuses to be told. She walked to the post office with the unhurried step of a woman going to buy string. The light had turned to the silver that comes before rain. Mr. Finch stood in his doorway with envelopes he did not need to sort. "A penny stamp, Miss Marple. The half-pound of patience, if you stock it," she said, and asked for ledger paper. As he fetched it, she admired his pigeonholes. So convenient. "Do you keep raffle counterfoils long?" "A week for order," he answered. "Then the vicar collects what he will." She glanced at the small locked drawer whose key lived on a bit of tape. And letters addressed under false names? Mr. Finch coloured with the embarrassment of the conscientious. "We deliver what is paid for." "Of course," Miss Marple said amiably. "I ask only because a very small blue scrap is tiresome, if not matched to the correct blue scrap." She left a faint agitation behind. That is often enough to settle dust, where one hopes to read a footprint. Passing the dressmakers, she saw Miss Barton in profile at the machine. A bottle of violet cologne pushed farther back than usual, as if modesty could be improved by distance. Miss Barton looked up, met Miss Marple's eye, and set her jaw with a decision that would be mercy in a better dress. She took her cloak and locked the door. Miss Marple did not follow closely. From the corner by the forge, she watched Miss Barton go not toward the inn, but toward Goose Lane. At the same moment, Hannah came out of her mother's cottage with a wrapped parcel, saw the dressmaker, and stopped. The stop was only a breath. Then both women continued, passing without a word and pretending other purposes, exactly as they had passed on that earlier day at 1. Repetition is confession in softer clothes. She went on to the church, where the vicar, relieved that clocks had returned to the sphere of theology, showed her an envelope delivered to the vestry box. No stamp outside. A typed line within, "The copy must be destroyed, J." "Typed," the vicar said, as if typewriters were a moral failing. "We have none in the parish." "We have 3, Miss Marple corrected gently. The school, the solicitor, and Miss Barton for her invoices. But typing is less informative than timing. If J were truly many, he would send a man. Therefore J is one, presently without his partner, uneasy in his solitude." She walked home through the first spatter of rain and set her small notebook on the table. "Jameson, messenger, mapmaker, not leader. J single-hand borrowing plurality. Blue missing St. Aldwyn stub. Tidy. Who removes what offends order? Agnes tidies rooms, not records. Finch tidies drawers, not other people's stubs. Miss Barton tidies lives." She paused, hearing how the last word sounded when spoken to oneself, and yet she brought the copy rather than burn it. Brave cowardice. That leaves one more tidy soul uncounted. The clock on her mantel ticked with loyal smallness. In the evening Hawkes came with news clean as rain. Jameson had yielded nothing but a card for a London address where rooms are let by the hour and promises by the dozen. Yet the constable at the telegraph office intercepted a draft by a stranger who asked to send it collect to Bristol. St. Aldwyn contained. "Send instructions." Giant Mr. Finch, being slow with small coins, gave the man time to reconsider. The stranger reconsidered into the lane and vanished. "J is here," Miss Marple said. "He cannot resist orchestration from the wings. Tomorrow he will try for the copy itself, because boasting requires a trophy." "Where shall we put ourselves?" Hawkes asked. "Where trophies are kept by instinct," Miss Marple replied. "On a shelf behind a bar in a clock newly made honest. You at 11. I earlier. I wish to see who reaches for time when no one is watching." That night the village sounded hollow, like a shell held to the ear and mistaken for the sea. Rain moved along gutters. Shutters clicked. A fox trotted the green and paused beneath the inn sign as if reading. Miss Marple wound her bedside clock and listened to its stout little heart. She thought of the bar shelf with no coal laid, of a tidy woman choosing to carry a burden instead of burn it, of a clever girl coached into courage she did not yet possess, of a gentleman who preferred initials to names and partners to witnesses. Time, she knew, tempts people differently. Some try to hurry it, some to hide it, and some, when almost ready to tell the truth, simply listen. She turned down the lamp. In the dark, the ticking grew companionable. Tomorrow the honest clock would stand where a hand might reach for it. If a hand reached, she would see which fear guided it, and the rest would follow. Dawn edged in pale and clean, and Miss Marple woke with the neat certainty that comes when a pattern has turned from suggestion to shape. She breakfasted without hurry, then walked to the King's Arms while the square still smelled of wet flags and yesterday's rain. Agnes had already polished the bar. The brass shone the common virtue of well-kept things. The clock ticked with an honesty that made its earlier excitement seem almost indecent. Miss Marple asked for hot water, and as Agnes fetched it, slid the smallest of folded slips beneath the clock's rear panel. Nothing dramatic, only 6 words in a careful, fussy hand. Receipt placed behind clock for safety. It would not fool the innocent who do not read such notices. It would be irresistible to the sort of tidy mind that hates a stray paper like a stain. She sat a while and let the tap-room grow accustomed to the idea of her. Hannah came and went, quieter than quiet. The girl's fear had ripened into humility, which is safer. When Miss Marple had been sufficiently part of the furniture, she went out and crossed to the post office. Mr. Finch was at his counter, aligning envelopes so precisely that the corners made a single white edge. He was the kind of man who believes tidiness is the same as virtue, and often behaves as if it were. 3 halfpenny stamps, if you please, Miss Marple said, as if stamps were her great need. While Mr. Finch counted, she admired the small locked drawer and the better-than-necessary order of his pigeonholes. He was a little too grateful to be engaged in ordinary talk. Men who have been noticed by events long to be permitted back into anonymity. Anxious times, he said, with the sober relish of someone dignified by worry. The sergeant tells me one of Mr. Pye's associates has been taken. I hope it ends the matter. It rarely ends, Miss Marple said gently. It only changes its shape. People do not stop being themselves because a partner is removed. They become more so. He pressed the stamps into the blotter with care. Very true, he agreed, and looked almost pleased with the sentiment. At 11, Sergeant Hawkes came to her garden gate with an air of authorized uncertainty. "I've a constable behind the vestry and another at the lane," he reported. "Jameson sits in the cell writing clean denials. If Jay was his master, London will be no help. If Jay used him, Jay will come. Jay will come," Miss Marple said, "because trophies have been promised and he cannot bear a shelf that does not contain what he has told himself it must. But he will not come at 3. He will come when other people are at their dinners, because he dislikes being looked at when he tidies. They made no parade of watching." Hawkes went to the yard with a borrowed rake and a talent for idleness. Miss Marple took her knitting to the window table, where reflections lay like extra people. The inn drowsed into the noon hour with the stubborn ordinary of English appetite. Plates went out and returned. A child complained that ginger beer is not beer. Agnes corrected the child's mother without offence. The clock, indifferent to plots, moved its hands the same distance it always had. At 5 minutes past 1, Agnes took a tray upstairs to a guest who had chosen to be ill. Hannah fetched coal from the shed. The tap-room emptied into the silence of cutlery and gravy. A figure crossed the square with the careful ambling of a man who has always had time and wishes to keep it that way. He did not look into the inn. He looked at the church notice board as if weighing a sermon, then drifted past the doorway and turned into the yard. Miss Marple did not move her eyes. Her needles clicked. Hawkes, who had been a good boy once and remembered how to be still, did not lift his head. The man came back after a minute and entered by the front, a little out of breath as men are after doing something beneath their dignity. Mr. Finch, respectable as a ledger, took off his hat and brushed the rain dust from the brim. "A half of bitter, Mrs. Rowley," he said pleasantly. Agnes, coming down, started only the smallest adjustment and drew the beer. "Will you take it in the corner, Mr. Finch? The fire is sullen." He carried the glass to the very chair Mr. Pye had favoured. It is a curious thing how people sit in other people's habits when the occasion permits. He sipped, coughed, and dabbed his mouth with the square of handkerchief that never left his person. "Clocks," he observed conversationally, "have an extraordinary faculty for being either too much themselves or not enough." "They are like people in that," Miss Marple said. He smiled at her, and in the smile she saw the quality she had been waiting to recognize: the vanity of the minor official, the man who keeps small doors and believes all doors answer to him. He finished his half as if his throat had other business and stood. "I shall just see if Mr. Finch's letter is in the box," he remarked in the third person, a foolishness some tidy men permit themselves. Agnes, accustomed to his ways, nodded without interest. He passed behind the bar with the air of a neighbour absent-mindedly helpful. His fingers, unostentatious and neat, hovered at the shelf, then the panel, then the thin seam where wood meets habit. The panel slid, and his hand went in with the speed of someone who hates being seen untidy even by furniture. When it came out closed around the folded slip Miss Marple had baited, his face altered by so little that only a woman of her training would have noticed. Not guilt exactly, but the relief of something fitted to its place. "It would be as well to put that back," Miss Marple said, as mildly as if she had corrected a dropped stitch. "It is not yours." He turned slowly and tried the expression that had absolved him from childhood. "Dear Miss Marple," he said with a small laugh, "I do set wicked little tests." "Yes," she agreed. "Wicked enough for the wicked, kind enough for the frightened. You are neither, Mr. Finch. You are tidy. You intercept and arrange. When Jameson travels, you remain. You knew the letters, the names, the money orders. You knew who in St. Aldwyn scented their hopes with violets. You took the St. Aldwyn ticket stub because it did not belong in a drawer labelled Bristol. You dislike mismatched pairs." He attempted dignity. "This is outrageous." "Very," said Miss Marple. "To turn a post into a trap for women who fear paper more than men. You were clever enough to send Jameson to stand where scorn should fall. You were more clever than wise to plant twine on the landing after I mentioned it. You were at the vicarage when the registers were opened, and you have a typewriter in the back because the post office must keep one. You type J, because of course you would tidy yourself into an initial. It is both concealment and filing." Hawkes stepped out of the shadow so gently it did not startle anyone. "Mr. Finch," he said. The postmaster made a very small calculation and tried one more neatness. "You cannot prove I was at the hearth," he said. "You cannot make an accident into a crime." "No," Miss Marple said, and her voice was as soft as bread. "Nor would I. Agnes kept an honest house and found death in it. Miss Barton tried to mend a past with a needle. Hannah was used. Your crime is not the accident. It is the commerce before and after. The telegrams, the boxes of names, the maps of rooms you did not own. It is the arranging of other people's fear into your profit and your personal sense of order." He blinked, the first untidy thing he had done all day. "Order is virtue," he said, almost pleading. "Order is a tool," Miss Marple answered. "Virtue is what you do with it." Hawkes took the slip from Finch's hand, and with it the decent man's last pretence. Finch looked at Agnes, and what he sought in her face did not live there. "I have delivered your post 20 years, he said absurdly. "And I served your beer," Agnes answered. "We both did our jobs. One of us added to it." He came very near to saying he was sorry and did not. Hawkes led him away with a tired gentleness, because a village must go on living with itself after men have been taken from it. When the door closed, the taproom sagged, then righted. Agnes set her palm on the wood, as if to steady the whole house. Miss Barton arrived a little later, white with the effort of walking into a place where she had imagined herself despised. Miss Marple met her, and with practised hands took off the woman's gloves as a nurse would. "We are done with initials," she said. "You will tell the vicar what needs telling, and then you will go on making blouses neat." Hannah hovered, and Miss Marple gave her the Western photograph, the untouched one. "You will keep it," she said. "Not as a threat, not as a secret. As a lesson people cannot sell you again." By evening, the square had already begun to say what it would go on saying for years, that justice had been done, and neatly. The clock, innocent as a cow, ticked toward tea. Miss Marple took her shawl and stood in the doorway a moment, letting the ordinary wash back in. She thought of how fear had tried to turn minutes into accomplices, of how tidy minds can be as dangerous as cruel ones, and of how very strong, in their different fashions, Agnes and Miss Barton and that foolish, brave girl had been. She went home by the longest way, so the day would have time to settle, put the kettle on, and wrote in her small book, 2 names, 1 habit, accident armed by arrangement. Do not confuse slipping with pushing. Do not excuse arranging. Then she closed it. Because there would be one more section to this story, the village's return to itself, which is the most delicate part of all, and because endings, like clocks, must be kept honest. The village received the news of Mr. Finch's arrest with the same mixture of shock and satisfaction with which it had once received the birth of a 2-headed calf or the arrival of the railway timetable. No one had suspected the postmaster, so upright in his spectacles, so exact in his change. And yet, once the story was told, it seemed inevitable. The man who handled every letter, who knew every secret in every envelope, had merely stepped across a line most men pretend not to see. His downfall gave the village both a villain and a moral, which is the best kind of conclusion for gossip. Agnes Rowley found her inn restored to itself, though she was slower to smile, as if laughter must first be tested before it could be trusted. Hannah, chastened and quieter, applied herself to her duties with a new steadiness. The Western photograph remained in her possession, but now it lay folded in a prayer book, a memory rather than a menace. Miss Barton, pale but determined, returned to her sewing, though her tidy fingers would twitch for many weeks before they forgot the drawer that had once hidden erasers and knives. Each woman had been bruised by fear, but each was mended after a fashion, by the truth having been spoken aloud. Sergeant Hawkes, though proud of the capture, could not quite conceal that the victory was less his than Miss Marple's. He bore it in good grace, and in private admitted that her way of watching, of letting people declare themselves, was more effective than all his measurements and reports. He promised to send word if Jameson's London masters stirred, but Miss Marple only smiled. "Masters do not survive long when their clerks are taken," she told him. "Fear is a chain that snaps when one link is broken." On Sunday the vicar preached a sermon on honesty, and half the congregation listened with the absorbed expressions of those who hear their own story retold from the pulpit. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded so vigorously that her hat tilted. Convinced she had known the truth all along, Colonel Brabazon muttered that women were sharper than bayonets. The children yawned, which is the way of children. Miss Marple sat serenely in her pew, her knitting folded neatly in her bag. She was not triumphant. Triumph belonged to those who chase villains. Her satisfaction was of another sort. That fear had been named, that innocence had been defended, that order, true order, not the brittle kind Mr. Finch mistook for virtue, had been restored. For she knew too well that life in villages is a fragile thing, and that it takes very little, a letter, a photograph, a misplaced set of keys, for human nature to show its darker side. That afternoon, over tea with Mrs. Weatherby, she spoke almost lightly of the affair. "People imagine crimes are solved by cleverness," she said, stirring her cup. "But they are solved by watching. If you watch long enough, people will always show you who they are." Mr. Finch could not resist tidying even what was not his. Poor Miss Barton could not resist weeping in the same neat measure. Hannah, brave in her folly, wanted desperately to be seen. And Agnes. Agnes clung to her house as if it were her reputation, which in truth it was. Mrs. Weatherby sighed. "It makes one sad, Jane, to think how much trouble might have been avoided if people had only spoken the truth at the beginning." "It is rarely the beginning that tempts people," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is the middle, when they think they can tidy a corner, erase a date, or hide a scrap. The truth is always there. It only waits for the right eyes to see it." When she walked home through the twilight lanes, she paused at the green where the children played, their laughter untroubled. The King's Arms glowed hospitably again, its brass polished, its windows warm. The post office shuttered early, the drawer within it silent at last. Life had resumed its rhythm, though with a faint shiver that would linger in curtains and gossip for many years. And Miss Marple, with the quiet contentment of one who asks nothing for herself, reflected that people were not wicked so much as weak, and that weakness, when pressed, was as deadly as malice. She set her kettle on the hob, opened her notebook to the last page, and wrote a final line beneath her neat rows of observations. Fear untidy becomes violence. Fear confessed becomes forgiveness. Remember this. Then she closed the book, laid aside her spectacles, and poured her tea as serene as though nothing remarkable had ever happened in the village of St. Aldwyn at all.